Good morning and welcome to Beginning Composting for the Backyard Gardener. Today we're going to talk about the basics of starting a compost bin in your very own backyard. So to begin, let's discuss what compost actually is. Compost is a mixture of decayed organic material. So what does that mean? That means that we take all this plant matter, your leaves, your grass clippings, your kitchen scraps like your banana peels and your orange peels and your coffee grounds and your eggshells, and you mix them all up. You add a little bit of water, a lot of air, and you let this aerobic bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms get in there, and it decays and decomposes, and it makes this amazing fertilizer for your garden. So why should you do this? Well, for one thing, composting is good for for the environment. If you send all this organic material to the landfill, it won't break down. Landfills will pack as much trash in a given area as possible. They run it over, they push it down, they compact it. That means air cannot get in and it will not decompose. So when that happens, you end up releasing more methane into the air. Oh, we don't want to do that. The other thing, it's really great for your soil. It adds extra carbon and nitrogen to your soil. It will help your plants grow. It also helps retain water in the soil so you use less water. And it also introduces valuable microorganisms into your soil, which will help aerate the soil. It will convert nitrogen into a usable form. And there's a lot of plants out there that like nitrogen and will eat the nitrogen right out of the soil. It also can repel some of your plant diseases and it reduces the need for chemical fertilizers. In the end, this will save you money. It will save you money on water, it will save you money on fertilizers, and you'll end up with a really gorgeous garden. So what do you need to start your own compost bin? Well, the first thing you need is you need a container, which we will just discuss in a minute. You need air and water, and then you're going to take your brown material and your green material, and let's discuss what those are. So your brown material will make up 2 to 3 parts of your compost. This is the higher carbon material, is the dry, it's bulkier, it takes a little bit longer to decompose. So this is your leaves most likely. Everybody usually has some access to dried leaves. You can also use pine needles that have fallen off the trees. You can use old straw, and if worse comes to worse, you can use a shredded paper. It's not what you want to make up the bulk of your brown material though. Your green material, it makes up 1 part of your compost. So it's 1 part of the green and 2 to 3 parts of the brown. So your green material is going to be the higher nitrogen material. It's the heavy, wet stuff. It will rot a lot quicker. So this will be your grass clippings when you cut the grass. It'll be all your kitchen scraps, your eggshells, your fruit and veggie peels, your coffee grounds. You can, if you're putting this in your garden, when you weed your garden, when you're deadheading your flowers, all that garden debris can go into your compost too. You can also add tea bags. You can add hair. Sounds weird, but if you have pets and you brush out your dog, you can throw all that hair in and it will decompose and be good for your garden. So what don't you want to put in the compost? First things first, do not put any pet waste in there. You can put chicken and horse manure in there, but you don't want to put any dog feces or cat feces in your garden or in your compost. You don't want to put any weeds that are diseased or plants that are diseased or maybe have seeds. So the only way to get rid of those is if you have a high enough temperature to break down those seeds and kill those diseases. And we can't guarantee that your compost is going to be hot enough to do that. So don't put that in. You also don't want to put in anything meaty or fatty or dairy. Those things will just become rancid and make your compost smell, and it's not good for your compost pile. So let's talk about the different systems, the different kinds of containers that you can use to make compost. So the first one here is a 3-bin system. So this is very popular if you have a lot of area. It's really good for doing hot compost. It holds a ton of material. So if you live somewhere where there's a lot of trees and you have a lot of leaves, you have a horse manure or chicken manure or something like that, it's got a lot of room to hold all those. It's really easy to access. You can get in there, you can turn it really easily. It's easy to harvest. It can be expensive and time consuming to start one of these bins, but they last a long time. It also uses up quite a bit of your yard space, so it's really not a great thing unless you have a lot of space that you're willing to give up to your compost. It's also not portable. You can't move it around your yard, and you do have to manually turn it, which could be a little bit tricky as you add more material to it. The heat method is very similar to the 3-bin method, except you're not putting it in contained, you're just throwing everything into a pile. So it's simple, it's inexpensive, you don't really need any materials. You can do this as hot or cold composting, and just so you know from this picture, you can see the steam coming off of that compost pile, so you know it's a hot compost pile. It's also really easy to harvest because all you have to do is go down there with a shovel and dig it out. Now, you also have to regularly turn this. That could be tricky as your pile gets larger. You also may attract pests, rodents, your pets could be attracted, and it's really easy for them to get in there since it's not contained. Again, this method also requires quite a bit of your yard space, and it doesn't look great. So if if you don't have a lot of room, you can't put it somewhere where it's, not going to be visible, you might not want to do something. Now, you can buy a compost tumbler. These are commercial products. They're really easy to turn your compost. You just turn the wheel. They are great for small spaces. And because they are contained, it does keep out the pest. Now, you can only put a certain amount of material in these before they're full. It's kind of hard sometimes to harvest it because they're difficult to empty, and because of their small size, it may freeze in the winter, and it's going to delay the amount of time it takes to compost. You can move these types of things into your garage or maybe your basement so you can continue composting during the winter months. Now, there's also something called worm bin composting. Now, this is great if you have a small space. If you live in an apartment and you're only planting like maybe a few flowers on your patio, they're really low maintenance. To start, it's a very small, compact bin that you use, and because you're usually doing this inside, you can do it all year long, even through winter. Now, they do use up a lot of moisture, and they do require some maintenance. They also can attract fruit flies and other pests, so that's something that you have to be wary about, especially if you usually do these. So what we're going to do today is just a compost bin. These can vary in size, so they're small space friendly because you can use whatever size bin you have room for. They're very low maintenance, they're contained so it keeps out pests, and they tend to be pretty inexpensive to start. Now, turning these bins tend to be a little bit more of a challenge, and can be limited in volume depending on what size bin you use. You can make a homemade bin. You can also buy a commercial composting setup. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of composting. So there's hot or active composting, which uses the fungi, the bacteria to decompose. They produce heat, it breaks down your material. When I say hot compost, they are hot. They will burn you if you stick your hand into a big hot compost pile. They can reach up to 155, 160 degrees, which is a little bit hotter than you want them to be, but we'll discuss that later. The hot compost you need to turn very frequently, but it will produce the compost a lot quicker, probably within 3 months, depending on your size of your pile. Now, the opposite of that is cold or passive composting. This uses more of the bugs, the millipedes, the earthworms to break down your material. It requires pretty minimal effort. You don't have to turn it, but it's going to take a lot longer to get your compost, probably at least a year, depending on the size of your compost bin. So let's start and decide how we're going to put together our compost bin. Prepare where you want it and your container. So you need to have an area that is semi-close to a water source because you're going to have to keep your compost moist. If it's in the sun, it's a little bit better. It will work a little bit quicker. You want to make sure that you have easy access to it. You're not going to be taking out all your kitchen scraps if you have to walk a mile and a half to get to your compost bin. It's also better if you place it on the grass or on the soil, something dirt, not a pavement. That way that it turns into the organic material a little bit easier. You get all the bugs and the insects and the worms from your land going up into your compost bin. So the location will depend on what type and how big of a bin that you're going to do. You also want to make sure that it's somewhere where your pets and wildlife aren't going to get into it. Then you want to get all your ingredients together to start. So we already discussed the different types of materials. So the green nitrogen-rich materials is going to make up 1 part of your compost material. The brown materials, the carbon-heavy materials, are going to be 2 to 3 parts of your compost bin. Then you're going to need water, and then it would be helpful if you have a nice, rich, organic soil to start it out with. Okay, so let's put together our compost bin. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put some twigs and brush on the bottom. That's going to give us some drainage. On top of that, we're going to add our green material. That's going to be our kitchen scraps, our grass clippings, something you can tell which is which because your green material is going to feel a little bit moister than your brown material. On top of the green material, add your brown material. That's going to be your dried leaves, your straw, your pine needles. Remember, there's going to be 2 to 3 parts brown material for every 1 part green material. Once you have your layer in, sprinkle a little bit of soil over top of this. You want a good organic soil to start with. This will add in some microorganisms right away and kind of jumpstart your compost. You don't have to put soil in between every layer every time you add material to your compost bin. Then you're going to lightly water everything. It should be damp, like a damp sponge. If it's too wet, it's going to start stinking. If it's too dry, you're not going to get compost. Then you're going to repeat as needed. For every time you add kitchen waste, you're going to have to add more brown material over top of it. Okay, so now that we went over the basics on what goes
let
into
me
a
show you a video of me
how to
putting it together.
Now you have a couple of options as we already talked about for bins. You could use a trash can. You could use even something as small as this. I wouldn't recommend that unless you're living in an apartment and you only have a small amount that needs to go in it. Your other option is an old Rubbermaid bin with a lid. Either way, if you use one of these closed containers, you do have to drill holes into them, and including the lid. I'm going to use this wire bin today to show you so you can see how each layer goes in. I also like this because it lets a lot of airflow in, so I have a better chance of getting a hot compost pile. And because it's open and on the ground, a lot more of the bugs and the worms will hopefully get into the compost pile. So to start, we're going to put 4 to 6 inches of brush in the bottom of it. Now this will help with drainage. Dump this in. And don't worry, it'll get nice and compact in there. And then on top of that, we'll start with our green material. So this is just stuff I've collected over the past couple of weeks and from my kitchen. So we try to put all that in. It's got some greens, it's got eggshells, it's got coffee grounds. The eggshells and coffee grounds are amazing for your compost. And once those are in, then we're going to add the browns. So the ratio that we wanted to do was 1 part greens and 2 to 3 part browns. So this is a good size amount of leaves. So I'm going to dump those in too. And on top of that, we are just going to dump a little bit of dirt. Okay, thank you. And this dirt I just got right from my garden. This will kind of jumpstart the composting pile. It's got some good bacteria, good bugs. I even saw some earthworms when I was digging it up. So that'll be really good for our compost. Once that's done, this is it. The only other thing that we would do is that we would wet it a little bit, but my greens are pretty wet and my leaves came out of the ground that were really wet from the spring that we're having today. So I'm going to leave it like that. And this is it. This is all we do now. The one thing I would say is if you notice that I'm in an enclosed garden, and that's because I have pets, the bacteria and stuff in the compost can make your pets sick. So I would make sure that if you have pets, that you either have it some kind contained or you put it in one of the containers that is contained.
Mommy,
So, all right, that's it. Thanks.
Mommy.
Okay, so let's talk about what we do next once we have our bin started. So you're going to add new materials as you have them. So I keep a coffee container, an empty coffee container in my kitchen underneath my sink, as we have kitchen scraps, kitchen waste every time I peel an orange, a banana, any kind of plant material, veggie material, fruit material, I add to that coffee container, and then every couple of days when it's full, I will go ahead and dump it into my compost bin. Now, add the greens, you also have to add some browns. So I usually keep a bin or a pile of dried leaves somewhere nearby so I can just sprinkle some leaves on top. You can also, if you're really, I know it's harder to find the browns during the summer months. They're really plentiful in the fall. So you can use shredded paper, but that should not make up the majority of your browns. Now remember, you have to make sure that you maintain the moisture of your compost bin. It should be the wetness of a damp sponge. So just sprinkle a little bit of water on top, and you can turn it every 1 to 2 weeks. That's optional. You don't have to, especially if you're doing a cold compost pile. I like to, because it really aerates the soil and mixes everything up, and you tend to have compost a little bit quicker than just waiting for it. And then you can also monitor the temperature. Now, this is especially important if you're going to do a hot compost pile. If the temperature gets too hot, you're going to kill off some of those bugs, and so you want to add extra materials to it, add extra moisture to it, turn it frequently when you're monitoring the temperature. You can buy really long compost thermometers at Lowe's or online or the garden supply stores. So there's not a whole lot that can go wrong. You add things to it, you leave it alone, eventually it will break down. Now, if you're smelling a bad smell, there's too much green materials in there. There's too much nitrogen. So you want to add the browns. Add a little bit of leaves, turn the pile, get everything kind of mixed up really well together. The same is if you have a hot pile, if you're finding that your temperature is over 150 degrees, you're not getting good airflow into that pile, and you don't have enough of the browns. So you want to add more browns, turn the pile, that will maintain the temperature. The opposite, if you have a pile that is really moist and isn't composting, you probably have too little of your greens, your kitchen scraps in there, so add some more grass clippings to it. You can also chop your leaves and your straw or whatever browns you're putting in there a little bit smaller. That will speed up the decomposition of the browns. They take a little bit longer than the greens to decompose. If your pile is too dry, you have too much of the browns, or you have too thick browns. So you want to add a little bit of water, you want to add a little bit of greens, and then remove some of those bigger nitrogen-rich materials, carbon-rich materials, and turn your pile, get it all mixed up again. So in 3 to 12 months, you should have a very rich compost. Now, if you want to know what it smells like, walk through the woods. That is a smell of compost, because nature does this automatically. The leaves fall off the trees, they're in the woods, nobody is raking them up. They will eventually cold decompose, and you have that rich dirt smell. That is what we're looking for. Okay, so what are we going to do with our finished compost? Well, most people just use it in their flower or veggie beds. If you're digging a hole to put a tree in, if you're digging a hole just to put plants in the ground, mix it in with your soil. It'll help fertilize your soil. You can also just use it as a top dressing for the beds. Just add a nice thick layer around your whole garden bed, and it's going to help retain the moisture of the soil, and it's going to help fertilize your plants. A few other people will just use it in their lawns to help their grass grow. It will grow lusher and thicker, and it won't need to be watered as frequently. So that's it. That is our presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Please let us know. We will be monitoring the chat and the comments. So let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much.